So far in our authentication implementation, we have logged users in with a correct password. So basically, we completed this first step of the authentication workflow, where a JSON Web Token is created and sent back to the client if the user provides a correct email and password. So next up, we will actually implement protected routes. So basically, using the created JSON Web Token in order to give logged-in users access to protected routes. And this is the second step of authentication. And so let's now go ahead and implement this functionality. So let's say that we wanted to protect the get all tours route. So basically only allowing logged in users to get access to a list of all our tours. And what that means is that before running the get all tours handler, so let's take a look at that. Okay, so before running this handler here, we would need to have some check in place in order to verify if the user is actually logged in or not, right? And so the best way of doing that, as you already know at this point probably, is to use a middleware function, all right? So in this video, in order to protect routes, we're going to create a middleware function which is going to run before each of these handlers, okay? So a function that is going to sit right here, so before this function here can run. And this middleware will then either return an error if the user is not authenticated, so if he's not logged in, or it will call the next middleware, which is in this case the get all tours handler, right? And that then effectively protects this route from unauthorized access. So let's go ahead and quickly create that middleware function and then put it here in order to illustrate what I just said. Okay, so here in our auth controller again, we will create a new middleware function, and it's called protect. All right, and just like before, I'm going to use catch async because once more, all of these functions are async functions actually. All right, and then here, of course, our middleware function. And for now, let's very simply call next here, just so that we have actually any body here in this middleware function. And then let's go back to our tour route and then protect this route. Okay, so first of all, I need to actually, of course, require this authentication controller module. So const and then require, it's in controllers, and then auth controller. Okay, and so now let's plug it in right here in the get all tours route. Okay, so auth controller dot protect. Okay, and so right now this middleware function is going to run first, and again, if the user is not authenticated, then there will be an error, and of course then the next middleware, so the one which actually gets and sends all of the tours, will then not be executed. Okay, and so again, this will then effectively protect the access to this resource here from users that are not logged in. All right, so let's go back here, not the user routes, but the auth controller. All right, and now about the implementation of this protect middleware, what exactly will we have to do? Well, let's start by lining out a couple of steps here. All right. And actually, first of all, we need to mark this function as async. Otherwise, we wouldn't really need the catch async, right? And you will see why we need this to be an async function in a second. All right. But now let's actually lay out the steps that we need to take in order to implement this protect middleware. So just like before, I'm going to put these steps here as comments. First off, we need to actually get the token and check if it's there, basically. So checking if it exists. Then next up, we need to validate the token. And so this is basically that super important step that we talked about before, where the JWT algorithm verifies if the signature is valid or if it's not. And so therefore, if the token is valid or not. Okay, and so actually let's call this here verification. I think that's what we called it in that slide where we talked about this before. All right. And if you don't really remember how that worked, well, you can always go back and rewatch that lecture. All right. Then next up, so if the verification was actually successful, then we also need to check if the user who's trying to access the route still exists. Okay, so check if user still exists. And I will talk more about why each of these steps are necessary once we start implementing them. All right, so for now this may not make so much sense to you, but again, I will talk about each step once we get there. All right, and finally, we need to also check if user changed password after the JWT was issued. Okay. Well, let's just say token here. We called it token everywhere else. Okay. And so only if there was no problems in any of these steps here, only then, of course, next will be called, which will then get access to the route that we protected. So in our current example, again, this get all tours handler, right? Okay, but let's go back and start implementing our very first step here. So basically getting the token and then check if it actually exists. So a common practice is to send a token using an HTTP header with the request, okay? So let's take a look at how we can set headers in Postman to send them along with the request, and then also how we can get access to these headers in Express. And let's actually do that one first. So here in app.js, I think we have this, we have this nice middleware here. And so in here, let's actually log to the console request.headers. Okay, so we talked about HTTP headers before, and so this is how we can get access to them in Express. Okay, so basically to the request headers. So the ones that a client can send along with their request. Okay, and so here in Postman, let's now actually get to the route that we're actually trying to protect, and then here set a header. And let's just do a test one and set it to Jonas. Okay, now I will just send this. And here in Express, let's take a look at that. And so indeed, here we get an object with all of the headers that are part of the request. So all of this here. And you see that there are a bunch of headers that Postman actually sends automatically along with the request. For example, it says that the user agent is Postman. It also sends the host and some other ones that we're going to talk about later, like accept, for example. Now what matters here is actually the header that we set ourselves. Okay, so the test header set to Jonas that we just sent in our request. Now to send a JSON Web Token as a header, there's actually a standard for doing that. So let's go back here, get rid of all of this. And so that standard for sending a token is that we should always use a header called authorization. Okay, so just like this. And then the value of that header should always start with bearer. Okay, because basically we possess this token, and then here the value of the token. So just like this random string that we got before. So let's just leave it here at this as an example. And so let's send that now. And then indeed we should get it here. Okay. Now Express then automatically turns all header names to lowercase, as you can see here. But of course, our header value here is still the same. Okay, and so basically this piece of the header value is our token. And so that's how we should now read that token from the header. All right. So if there actually is request.headers.authorization, okay, and if it starts basically with this bearer string here, okay, so rec.headers.authorization, and now this is a string, and so we can use starts with on that. Okay, so this is just normal JavaScript again. Okay, and so these are the conditions under which we actually want to save a token. Okay, so again, in case that the header exists and that its value starts with bearer. Okay, then in that case, we want to say that the token is equal to rec.headers.authorization. And now how do we actually get this second part of the string? Well, we're basically going to split the string by this space character, okay, which will then create an array with this bearer and with this token. And so then we're going to take that part of the array that we want. So split using space, and then from that array, we want the second element. All right. Now we can't actually define a variable inside of an if block because const and let, so the new ES6 variable declarators, are actually block scoped. And so whatever we define in this block here will then not be available outside of it. Okay, and so let's actually do that outside. And then simply reassign this value to the token. Okay. And now let's log the token to the console just to see if it works. Okay. And in fact, let's actually get kind of a real token here. So the one that we just logged in with. And then put that one here. All right. So send it. And here we go. So here we have our JSON web token that we just sent along with the request. Let's just quickly turn off this console log here. All right. And then just before we move on, let's then actually check if the token actually exists. Okay. So if there is no token, well, then, of course, we want to create a new error, right? And so, just like before, we return from this middleware and call the next one, okay? And now in here, we are then going to create an error. And so we will move straight to our global error handling middleware with this error, all right? So if there is no token sent with the request, then that means that we're not logged in. So let's send to the user, you are not logged in. Please log in to get access. All right. And now the status code for this kind of situation is 401, which means unauthorized. Okay. So not sure if we used that one before. And yeah, actually we did it here as well. Okay. And so this basically means that the data that was sent in the request is correct, but they're not enough, basically, to get the user access to the resource he is requesting. All right, let's give it a save here and test it out again. So if we basically take away this header here, then we should straight away go into that error, right? And indeed, you are not logged in. Please log in to get access with 401 unauthorized. Great, so that part is already working. All right, and now just to recap. So right now, we are not sending any token along with the request, right? And so for that reason, of course, there is no token, okay? And therefore, we create this error, which will then trigger our error handler middleware to send that error back to the client, okay? And then, of course, we do not get access to all the tours because, of course, this middleware runs before the get all tours controller. And so right now, this really is protected. Okay, so it's really working quite nice already at this point. But of course, this is far from enough, because it's not enough to just send a token with a request. It also needs to be a valid token. So basically a token where no one tried to change the payload. Okay, and the payload, remember, in our case, is always the user ID of the user for which the token was issued. All right, and so next up, we need to implement this verification step. But this lecture is already running pretty long, and there's still a lot of stuff to do here, and so let's actually leave that for the next video.